I will try to make this talk as nautical as possible.
Just for our live stream audience, I have to share the presentation.
Oh yeah, no problem.
Sorry about that.
No, you got it. Well, while we're waiting for that, I'll just say that I work for, I don't want to clip it. I feel like it'll sound funny, but I'll do it. All right. Oh, God. That's why I didn't want to clip it. Anyway, I'll say that I work for the Florida Public Archaeology Network, and for anyone who's not familiar, FPAN is a state-run, statewide educational organization, yeah, that one, that does education and outreach, assist local governments, and was really created to assist the State Division of Historical Resources. So we basically do lots of heritage tourism in Florida. We have 8 regions all throughout the state. I'm based in our southeast region, so I work as far north as Jupiter and as far south as Key West. Yeah, those guys. So we are actually required by law to exist in the state of Florida as basically a heritage outreach workers. We've got 8 regions all throughout the state. We're actually funded by the state legislature and by a grant that is given to us every year. That goes to University of West Florida, our headquarters, and then that grant goes all the way to all these other universities throughout the state. Technically, I am an FAU employee, and so is my colleague in Southwest Florida. In addition to assisting the State Division of Historical Resources, because as you can imagine, folks don't really have that much of a travel budget, and we're kind of everywhere. Most of us at FPAN are trained archaeologists. Most of us have our RPA certification, or Registered Professional Archaeologist certification, which basically says that we're all qualified to run our own digs and that we adhere to a certain ethical code. So anywhere you go in Florida, you've got a great resource for public outreach and learning about our incredible history here. So today we're going to be talking about who made the Everglades. This is one of my favorite subjects. It's really, really cool, the history of Florida and everything that's happened over the last several thousands of years. To really understand what's happening anywhere in Florida, hydrologically, geologically, biologically, we actually have to start with our bedrock. Oh, there we go. Okay. So we have to go all the way down to our bedrock, and I can talk about oolitic limestone for a really long time. I think it's incredibly exciting, but I will try to keep it brief today. So Florida forms, well, the bedrock of Florida forms between 65 and 23 millions of years ago. If you're not familiar with oolitic limestone, that's what all of our bedrock is here in the great state of Florida. It's a sedimentary rock. It kind of grows when it's underwater. It's formed by wee little tiny zooplankton and other microorganisms dying, and their little tiny skeletons kind of getting stuck into like a larger clump of calcium carbonate, and it kind of grows really quickly. In that way, it kind of grows when it's underwater, and then during periods of sea level rise and fall, when it's exposed to the elements, that's when it gets kind of worn away. It's really, really soft, and this is why we see so many sinkholes or cenotes in the state of Florida. And that affects our environment quite a bit, as you can imagine. So we are a really low-lying state. In a lot of places, we're at 0 feet above sea level. So we're really sensitive to hydrodynamic events, or basically like events that involve water throughout the Caribbean. And here's what Florida looked like during different parts of the Pleistocene era. So laser beam. Okay, doesn't want to show, but this here is what Florida looked like around 2.5 million years ago when it was first forming. We're a very new state in a lot of ways. And then over here, this dotted line is what we look like during the last ice age. around 14,000 to 12,000 years ago, when people were first arriving to Florida, as far as is known to empirical science. This is actually what Florida looked like during that last glacial maximum. That's when the sea levels were really low. And so Florida was about twice the size it is today, and with a completely different biome and terrifying huge megafauna, like glyptodonts and giant ground sloths and mammoths and dire wolves, which are real animals and not just things that George R.R. Martin made up. And frankly, I'm glad they're all dead. No offense to any of those creatures. But basically, Florida's gone through a lot of changes, partially because of that oolitic limestone bedrock. And keep that in mind, not just because it's very cool, but because it is going to come into play later. So some housekeeping before we really get started is the difference between fossils and artifacts. Fossils are evidence of living things preserved in the Earth's crust. They're actually not bones. They're kind of like calcified stone in the shape of bones. And then artifacts are anything made or modified by humans. Generally, these guys don't overlap. We're too young as a species to be fossilized in a lot of cases, except for really, really early humans. Paleoanthropologists work with those folks quite a bit. Anatomically, modern humans were only about 300,000 years old. But anyway, so that's basically the difference. We see lots and lots of artifacts in the Florida Keys and throughout South Florida. They're incredibly fascinating, and people have been living here since time immemorial and affecting the environment, and the environment has been affecting them. I think that's about it. So, kind of begin at the beginning. This is, as far as we know, the oldest evidence of human beings living in Florida. We used to think the oldest site in Florida was on the Wassissa River. This is the Wassissa River bison. You can actually see this guy at University of Florida's Museum of Natural History. Previously, the oldest evidence of human occupation in Florida was this guy, a projectile point lodged into a bison skull. And I say projectile point because it is a fancy science word for arrowhead. And we like to get really technical about it because people could be using it as much more than arrowheads. They could be spearheads, they could be scraping tools. So we try to keep it open-ended. If you want to be a real nerd about it, you can say projectile point. In the 90s and then revisited in 2016, the oldest human habitation in Florida got pushed back to 14,550 years ago in the Osceola River. That's where a mammoth tusk was found with a bunch of cut marks on it, surrounded by projectile points and chert debitage. So this was really exciting. To put all of these big numbers in perspective, the Great Pyramid at Giza is around 4,000 years old. So humans have been living in Florida, as far as we know, 10,000 years longer than the pyramids of Giza were built. So yeah, folks have been around for quite a long time. Moving forward in time came the Archaic period. That's between around 10,000 and 3,000 years old. You're not going to hear an archaeologist say this was a really boring time in history, but this was a really exciting time in Florida's history because this is when we start to see really intense sea level rise and climate change. I said the words, but this is a really cool time. We're going to be talking about this quite a bit today because this is when we start to see long-term and seasonal campsites in the Everglades. This is when we start to see people really change the world around them. And at this point, side note, during the Paleo-Indian period and during the Archaic period, we don't know what indigenous people in Florida were calling themselves. This is far past any point where we had much detailed oral history. Most folks refer to both these periods and also going into the Glades period as the ancestral period. So we don't have quite as extensive archaeological evidence from these time periods as we do from more recent archaeology, but we still have really cool things to study from this time. And this is really what we're going to be focusing on today. From around 3,000 years ago to 1500 or 1750, depending on who you ask, was the Glades period. And this is kind of going along with the woodland period in the rest of the United States, but we're Florida and we're very weird and we have to say our own things. So this is when we start to see way more detail during this period. This is when we start to see monumental architecture. This is where we start to see large-scale infrastructure and navigation and really long-term complex settlements all over Florida. This is where we start to see entire artificial islands made out of shell. When we start to see massive Calusa and Haga and Ais settlements all over Southeast Florida. And there's really exciting stuff going on during this period of history as well. Oh, I'm so sorry, this is missing folks in the Keys. But this is who all was living in South Florida at the time of the arrival of Europeans when colonization started. So where we're at right now is where Maricumbe people were living, and farther south in the Keys is where Guarangumbe people were living. North of us was Tequesta land and Haga land, as well as Belglade or Miami culture around the Kissimmee Okeechobee rivershed, which is where the Everglades originally started. There's also Calusa people living in Southwest Florida. There's a lot of arguments. For a long time, archaeologists were thinking that everybody else was kind of paying tribute to a large Calusa empire, and more we're kind of trying to see if there's any more nuance there and if there was maybe something else going on. Okay, now that we've done our basic housekeeping, we're going to get into the Everglades. So here is where the Everglades is currently located today. If you want to visit the Everglades, most folks go to Everglades National Park, but there are a few different national preserves as well as water conservation areas where you can enjoy this incredible biome. So the Everglades are incredibly important for a lot of reasons. They are an estuarine environment where lots of fish can raise their young. They're a home for migratory birds. Mangroves are incredibly important. They are carbon fixing. They protect us from hurricanes, and they are all over the Everglades. And prior to early July of this year, this was one of 2 dark sky places, international dark sky places east of the Mississippi and in the state of Florida. So the Everglades has 8 different biomes overall. If you are really enterprising or perhaps insane, you may be able to visit all of them in one day. I highly, highly recommend camping in the Everglades if you are able to. It's incredibly beautiful. You can rent out a beach on the 10,000 islands, and some of them you can set little campfires on. Just so y'all are aware, it's extremely exciting. As Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, or as I like to call her, Margie Stoney Dougie, used to say, there is only one Everglades. Highly recommend getting out and exploring it as much as you can. The biome that we're going to be focusing on today, though, is tree islands. Has anyone ever driven across Alligator Alley or 41? I see some hands going up. Okay, so if y'all have ever looked off the side of Alligator Alley or Tamiami Trail and seen these weird little raised areas of trees, that's what we're going to be talking about today. So most tree islands are located in South Florida, and you can actually see some of them from satellites, these weird green splooshes here. You can see them following the flow of water, and that is because of the way that they are formed. Tree islands are these really unique biomes. We kind of have like a plan view seen from above and like an exploded view seen from the side here. There are 3 different types of tree islands. One is a pop-up or battery tree island. These are the smallest kind, and they are what they sound like. They pop up and disappear very quickly, sometimes over the course of just a wet season or just a year. There are also strand tree islands, which are also kind of short-lived. Things can be very ephemeral in the Everglades. And as archaeologists, what we're most interested in are the fixed tree islands. And for anyone who can't really read the little explanation here, this dark green area is the head. Light green is a tail or near tail. Black is the far tail. And then the yellow band all the way around it is the transitional zone. And this is kind of what it looks like here. Off on the side. whenever you see these large tree islands, if they've been around for a while, that's when they can slowly become a cypress swamp and then eventually a hardwood hammock. So a change in elevation of just a couple feet in the Everglades can completely change the kinds of plants and animals that you see there. The way these lads get formed, for a very long time, all of us in science were working off ecological theories. We thought that a combination of bird guano, water flow, and windborne particulates was able to kind of blow all these different seeds around the Everglades. And once those plants took root and the roots were able to kind of get down into the peat there, they were able to kind of spring up, and then they would kind of accrete over time, following the flow of water. And for a really long time, archaeologists would go out into the Everglades, folks like John Goggin and other folks who worked for FAU and University of Miami. They would go out to the Everglades, they would dig past a certain amount of topsoil, and they would hit a layer of oolitic limestone bedrock, and it would be really smooth, really hard. They couldn't get past it, and they would say, okay, this is all we've got here. This only goes back to the Glades era. We're only seeing pottery from the Glades era. We're only seeing tools from the Glades era. So this is only really going back 2,500 years ago. And when we would talk to indigenous folks, the like Seminole and Miccosukee people, they would say, we've been here a lot longer than that. And it'd be like, okay, well, whatever. Turns out, unsurprisingly, they were correct. This was a really interesting project. An archaeologist, previously head of the Southeastern Archaeological Center of the National Park Service, Margot Schwadron, actually went out and did a survey of, I believe, 48 fixed tree islands throughout the Everglades. And she also dug through that first layer of topsoil, but she also took a concrete saw to that layer of oolitic limestone bedrock. And that's what ended up kind of making the difference, because remember how oolitic limestone is a metamorphic rock that kind of forms over time, that kind of grows when things are underwater. So there had been a lot of really intense wave action throughout the Everglades for a lot of reasons over time. Once to start this survey, they kind of focused on those fixed tree islands. And sort of once they were digging through the topsoil and got down to the bedrock, she would take a concrete saw and then bust through it. And there ended up being quite a lot more midden dirt that ended up dating back to around 5,000 years ago. And midden dirt is spelled M-I-D-D-E-N, not M-I-T-T-E-N. It's essentially a fancy science word for trash. Midden is a trash deposit, sometimes from a historic context, sometimes from a pre-colonial context, where people were throwing all their stuff over time. A dump is a midden that we have as well. And archaeologists were not really interested in, you know, gold or rubies, but we're very interested in garbage. We love garbage. It's like the most exciting thing in the world for us. So the difference between what Dr. Schwadron and her team were seeing over that, what we call calcrete layer, that smooth layer of limestone that can form during intense wave action, was stuff from cultural belongings from the Glades era up on top, lots of shell artifacts, lots of bone, and then below that, and also ceramics, Glades era ceramics. And most of the ceramics that we see in South Florida are incised, which means they're not really painted. A lot of them can be very plain. When we do see a lot of patterns on them, they end up being kind of carved into the clay and really geometric. And we see similar stuff in the Keys as well. So underneath that layer, there ended up being really rich midden dirt and evidence of people living there for a really long time and people eating there. And there would also, the ceramics in Florida only started being made around 4,500 years ago. And there was also this big technological horizon of going from using stone tools, which the closest location where you can get the right kind of stone you need for it is in Tampa Bay, around 4,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago. Frankly, everybody got tired of schlepping all that way to get this stone that they needed, and they started using more shell tools. And that's part of how they were able to date these layers of dirt. So Dr. Squadron and all these other archaeologists published their results in 2006, and they found evidence of all of the local fish and animal life living on those tree islands. They could see what indigenous people were eating all that time and got some clues about how they were living. So we had to adjust all of our ecological theories to be socio-ecological theories. And we've been able to talk with tribal archaeologists with the Seminole TIPO, or Tribal Historic Preservation Office, about how people were living on Tree Island camps, even into living memory. And folks would be living on one side of the island, they'd be tossing their trash and refuse, animal bones, things like that, on the other side of the island. Eventually that would become composted, it would turn into that rich midden dirt. And once that process was done, they would move to the other side and kind of repeat this slowly over time. So after thousands and thousands of years, you've ended up with these massive islands that you can see off the sides of those roads. So, you know, we talk a big game about sustainable architecture using local materials, and it doesn't get much more sustainable than that. And these structures have lasted 5,000 years or more. So here are the kinds of plants that we end up finding on tree islands. All of these have some kind of edible component. You can eat oak acorns, you can eat saw palmetto, berries, and also palm hearts. Has anyone ever eaten hearts of palm? Yeah, delicious. You can also eat kunti, but only after you have processed it very carefully and correctly. Otherwise, it is a deadly neurotoxin. So please don't go out after this talk and try to eat kunti root. It will not go well for you. And here are some of the kinds of animals that we end up seeing on tree islands. That can end up showing up on tree islands once they start to kind of be built up over time. And white-tailed deer especially were a really important food source, and we see a lot of really beautiful carvings made out of deer bone as well. Of course, people were also eating fish quite a bit. And here's where we get to be nautical. So before the United States semi-successful attempts at draining the Everglades, everything from the Kissimmee River down to Lake Okeechobee, all the way down to the ocean, was the Everglades. It was a slow-moving river, and that's part of why people kind of worked on this larger infrastructure of not just tree islands, but also up farther north, shell islands, and also earthwork mounds going up into the Kissimmee, Okeechobee, Everglades watershed. To get around, people ended up using dugout canoes. And this is a technology that's been developed kind of at the same time all over the world. The way it kind of worked out in the Everglades is that folks would go out, they would find the biggest tree they could find, typically a cypress tree. They would cut that down with a shell axe. If you've ever been out to any remote sites in the Everglades, you know that conch shells can get incredibly large. And folks would use those as axes, kind of get a wooden handle and affix those to the conch shell using animal sinew, the evidence for which was actually found in the Keys. And then they would cut down, they would end up cutting down a cypress tree. They would hollow it out slowly, and you can kind of see the process here, where indigenous folks in the Archaic era and everybody living in South Florida in the Glades era would slowly burn out the interior of these canoes over time. And they would be layer by layer, just burning all these different layers and scraping out the burnt pieces with an adze until finally all these things were hollowed out and you had the equivalent of an SUV that could take all of your stuff and your family anywhere you wanted to go. And there's emerging evidence, and I'm just going to throw this in there because this is kind of new. There's emerging evidence that there was pretty intense and well-planned large-scale infrastructure for navigation with these canoes. Up farther north in the KOE watershed, There's a lot of, and also in the Calusa area, there's lots of evidence for big earthwork mounds with all of these linear features shooting off of them, kind of pointing to other different sites. So that's emerging research. I'm happy to pass that article along if anyone is interested in learning more, because it's really cool. So human impact hasn't just been happening, prior to colonization. We're doing a lot of changes as well. Seminole folks have also been shaping and been shaped by the Everglades. Here, folks staying on a hunting camp. You can see what I think looks like a cooking chickie back there in the corner. And this is how folks are, continuing to live even to this day. So I highly recommend, if you can, visiting the Miccosukee Village as well as the Tatiki Museum on the Seminole Reservation. You can learn a lot about how people were living and how folks spent their time throughout all of Florida's history. And the Everglades were really significant in terms of the, obviously what we call the Indian Wars, what the US refers to as the Seminole Wars, the Seminole tribe refers to as a long period of aggression, and one long period of aggression rather than 3 different wars. And so folks were able to use their knowledge of tree islands in the Everglades to successfully engage in guerrilla warfare against the United States. They never surrendered to the US, never signed any treaties. And this is also really cool because a lot of the generals who ended up becoming really famous throughout the Civil War were kind of sent to fight Seminole and Miccosukee people as like a proving ground. So all of these tree islands were used as a proving ground for the Civil War and US military history as well. There's just so many stories going in every which way. We've done lots and lots to modify the Everglades into modern times. We dredged part of the Everglades in order to build the Tamiami Trail and the Alligator Alley. And these were really rough projects. They had a body count. They took many years. Some folks saw them as folly for a very long time, but eventually they were built through very hard work. And even before that construction and around that construction, we would also see modern Gladesmen living in the Everglades. And the creation of the National Park Service and Everglades National Park and all the different parts of the national parks also really changed how folks were living. And Florida crackers, like many generations of Floridians ended up living in the Everglades and on tree islands as well. So these things changed a lot. So here's how the Everglades looked historically, all of the different environmental areas that we see. For anyone who, it's a little bit blurry, but the yellow blotchy area is swamp forest made of mostly custard apple trees. The big orange blotch is sawgrass marsh. This is where we see a lot of tree islands. The blue blotch that is not Lake Okeechobee are lily-dominated deep water areas known as sloughs. The purple blotches are wet prairies. And that little pink band are cypress forests. And then farther down south, we also see lots of tree islands in that marsh prairie area. And this is how the Everglades would flow historically. So we kind of start all the way up here and go all the way down here. And this is a modern satellite image, and you can kind of see all the settlements just south of Lake Okeechobee. Why is there such a big concentration of farmland in that area, you ask? The answer is that the US also dredged part of Lake Okeechobee, and they ended up revealing dirt that was so nutrient dense because of all the middens there, because of the way the lake works there, that it was designated as it ended up becoming a federally designated strategic resource for farming. So this is where all of America gets their sugar and their tomatoes. Towns like LaBelle are really significant farming towns and Immokalee is also a really significant farming town over there. That's also where a weird amount of football players come from. I don't really understand why that is. you may assume I'm not much of a sports person, but that is what happens. So currently we're in the midst of the largest and longest running infrastructure project in the United States. I think also maybe the most expensive, the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan, which aims to restore that historic flow of the Everglades going from north to south. Currently, if you've seen or heard of any of the fish kills happening off the Gulf Coast and at the Atlantic, often that's due to phosphates and fertilizer and other wastewater running out of Lake Okeechobee from that farmland around it and off into the Gulf through this east-west canal system. And that was part of, dredging the lake in order to have all of that farmland. So the plan is for the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Project to build a series of canals that are going to be controlled by a button, dams that you can block and unblock depending on the health of the water, that'll restore that north-south flow. Lots of folks have been concerned about this historically because the Everglades is also a water source for all 2 million of us living in South Florida. The Florida aquifer system and all of that oolitic limestone bedrock, because of its Swiss cheese nature, ends up acting as an aquifer and cleaning our fresh water for us. And that's why I think we have some especially delicious tap water in South Florida. So the CERP has cost, at this point, probably well over 10 billion. It has been running for 35 years. It is a bipartisan project. And this is kind of how it's been going and how folks hope it's going to go. And the interesting thing about this is that this is an Army Corps of Engineers project. And if anyone remembers the Dakota Access Project, the DAPL with the water protectors, where there were a lot of skirmishes between the Lakota Sioux people and the U.S. military, I believe, unless it was the National Guard. Brain is not that good. This is the same kind of project, but those conflicts didn't happen here because the Army Corps of Engineers consulted with the Seminole tribe really, really early on. And there was a lot better work in terms of anthropological archaeology happening there. Part of the reason the DAPL was such a huge issue was that there wasn't much communication with the tribes there, and archaeologists would be sent out looking for artifacts, cultural belongings, or human remains. And that wouldn't really encompass what Lakota Sioux people considered to be. They'd also consider certain rock formations sacred, certain trees sacred. Want a pipeline through their lands and their water, and that's part of why there was conflict. And it was handled very differently down here. So I think that's just interesting to compare those two. So lots and lots of archaeological work happens throughout the Everglades. That really mucky area in the northern Everglades, just south of Lake Okeechobee, also has an incredible wealth of archaeological material and history. The Palm Beach County archaeologist, Chris Davenport, has been doing a lot of really incredible work to make friends with everybody living in LaBelle and Immokalee and all these other folks in Palm Beach County, in order to make friends with sugar barons. And one of them ended up being a history nerd. One of his employees ended up finding a duck point on part of his farm, and he contacted the county archaeologist about it and was actually kind enough to set aside a full acre for archaeologists to investigate. And that happened in 2017 and 2018. This was a project that we also helped out on and that FAU partnered with. And that project pushed back inhabitation in the northern Everglades to around 2,500 years ago, where previously we'd only seen evidence for 1,500 years ago. And there was lots of information also about the kind of diet that people were eating there. We saw lots and lots of snake bones, lots of fish bones, and also a really beautiful carved water panther image. And this massive plume of smoke here that you can see over the archaeological survey happening and over the excavation units getting dug is actually a cloud of sugarcane being burnt before it's harvested. So we would be working up there and then getting rained on by ash and freaking out for about 5 minutes before remembering that there's no volcanoes in South Florida and looking up to see the sugarcane being burnt. There's also the Wedgwood site, another tree island site in the northern Everglades that was actually used as a field school for FGCU, or Florida Gulf Coast University. So this was another way to study that rich midden dirt, all the stuff that people were eating back in the day, and what kind of tools they were using, what kind of ceramics they were using. That helps us kind of recreate old trade routes and get some clues as to how people were living their lives in the past. We got to work with the Seminole Tipo here, and they told us how folks were camping on tree islands and what they were eating, what they weren't eating. And there are all kinds of different cultural taboos between our cultures. Like, we found all of these snake bones, and we were like, yeah, I'd eat snake. Yeah, people were eating snake. And then the Seminole Tipo folks, a lot of whom were tribal archaeologists, were like, no, people were eating snake. We don't do that. That's gross. You guys are crazy. So doing lots of anthropological archaeology. And all this work is, ongoing. It's super interesting. I feel very grateful and fortunate to be involved. And it's a really exciting time to be an archaeologist. We're always coming up with, more evidence as to what was happening in the past. We're kind of trying to build a better relationship with the Seminole and Miccosukee tribes. We can get a fuller look at what was happening and a better understanding of the past. And it's pretty much all I got to say. When you look out at, virgin wilderness in the Everglades, whenever you're making the kind of mind-numbing drive across Alligator Alley, and it seems like nobody's ever been there. The fact is, people have been there for a really long time, doing really interesting stuff, and we're learning more cool stuff about that stuff every single day. So thank you all so much for having me here, and I think we have time for questions. Yeah. Sorry. Oh, sorry. I'd also like to we have a bunch of free giveaways in the back of the room with lots of cool brochures, and you can find our website and where we have our events. Yeah, and you can take a koozie. And there's lots of cute little postcards and bookmarks and pens and little brochures of a few of the different shipwrecks that are preserved by the state of Florida that have some cool plan view maps of shipwrecks in them, if you are also a nerd about maps like I am. Sorry, please continue.
Questions?
Okay, yeah, we're gonna figure this out. I saw this hand over here first.
So as an archaeologist, what do you find the most interesting or intriguing epoch or time period? I know it's asking like, favorite friend or child, but what kind of has sparked you the most out there?
Hello. Okay, cool. So for anyone, nice, thank you. So for anyone who couldn't hear, the question was, what do I find to be the most interesting time period in Florida? And that is, in fact, a difficult question to answer. But it's hard to say because every time period has so much interesting things to learn about it. I think most of the work that I've done personally has been on Glades era sites, and also in like colonial exchange era sites. So I'll say that that's been the most interesting for me. That's where we see monumental architecture. That's where we see lots of artificial islands, just really cool infrastructure that people were building back in the day. That's also where a lot of the most iconic art comes from. That's where the Key Marco cat comes from. That's where a lot of really beautiful bone carvings come from. And I'm also an art history nerd, so I'm very partial to that type of thing. So that's what I'd say.
I thought there was one back here. Bob, you next.
Do you know when people first came to the Keys and where did they come from?
The question was, do I know when people first came to the Keys and where did they come from? I am not 100% sure. That hasn't, unfortunately, been my research, focus. I can figure that out and get back to you. But I just haven't really worked in this area as much as Sarah has. I apologize. But a lot of, I'll speak in general for Caribbean archaeology, is that a lot of the history of the Caribbean actually starts in northern Venezuela. And there are lots of sites throughout the Caribbean that are quite old, quite a lot older than you'd expect. So there is strong evidence that folks may have gone, and there are a few different waves of peopling of the Americas. Some folks came along the Bering Strait, some folks came along the Kelp Highway, and then into South America, and then up into the Lesser and Greater Antilles. So that's one of the ways folks may have come here, but there's a lot of different waves of migration that may have been happening at lots of different times. There's never just like one story about how people got here. But as far as the Keys specifically, I'm not sure what the oldest site down here is. The oldest site that I know of in South Florida is the Cutler Fossil Site, and that is on the grounds of the Deering Estate in South Dade. That dates to around 9,700 years ago. And I apologize if this isn't accurate, but I'm pretty sure I remember there are some sites in the Caribbean dating to around 7,000 years ago. So folks have been here for an incredibly long time, and there's evidence that they could have come from South America or possibly south from other bits of North America. Thanks.
You got yours off.
Thank you. With the historic flow project that you mentioned earlier, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about that, a little bit more. And with the historic droughts that we've been having, do you think this would have benefits or cons with those droughts?
If I could talk, the question is if I could talk a little bit more about the, I keep messing with this thing, about the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan and whether that's being affected by drought. So last year in October, I was actually super lucky to attend the Miccosukee tribe's Art and Science Symposium, and they had some of the biologists from the tribe talk about how they were kind of stewarding all the different species living in the Everglades. The droughts are definitely affecting all these animals. They've had to relocate some animals from other parts of the Everglades onto their reservation to sort of repopulate these areas. And the droughts are definitely, in some cases, causing a much worse mosquito season than usual. And yeah, maybe y'all have noticed that. I've certainly noticed that. Because depending on when the unseasonable dryness happens, sometimes the mosquitoes can lay their eggs and sometimes they get washed away. But if they don't get washed away, they hatch and they come and eat you for weeks and weeks. Yeah, I was also recently told by another archaeologist who has friends who are like mosquito engineers, bioengineers, that supposedly if mosquitoes disappeared, it wouldn't harm the rest of our biome. And everyone's like, just kill them all. So anyway, but yeah, the droughts, I don't know that they are affecting the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan all that much. I think it's kind of continuing as it has been. The way archaeologists have been involved in that has been to do archaeological monitoring. And when we mentioned CRM earlier, or cultural resource management, that's private or commercial archaeology. That's where 80% of all archaeologists in the US get their jobs. That's what I did before I became a science educator. And there's phase one, which is usually a pedestrian survey, which is a fancy science word for looking around at stuff on the ground. And that also involves shovel tests, which is where we dig a 50 centimeter by usually 1 meter deep hole around different parts of a parcel of land to figure out whether it's positive or negative for cultural belongings and any kind of cultural material. And there's phase 2, which is if we do identify cultural material, if it's concentrated on a part of a site, then we open up larger test units. And then there's phase 3, which is when you see like documentaries about archaeology where there's like 20 people running around with a bunch of buckets and trowels and there's huge holes in the ground. And that's phase 3. That's kind of a unicorn in this field. We don't get to phase 3 all that often. And archaeological monitoring is where you stand in front of a backhoe with Bob the Builder the safety outfits on, and you tell them no. Well, they're already digging, and if you see something that could be culturally significant, and you show up with your high-vis vest and a clipboard, and they hate you so much, and it's very much a last-ditch effort to protect cultural materials, and sometimes just like a sort of technicality in a site that, you know, previously had cultural material, but it's been dug up, or where there might be cultural material, but there hasn't, it's not like a high or medium risk archaeological zone. So the archaeologists working on that project are doing compliance projects. They have been sort of standing in front of the bulldozers and making sure that nothing significant comes out of those sites. If they do find something significant, they record it, they report it to their offices, and those offices report it to the tribes. So I don't know that the droughts have been affecting that project all that much. They've certainly been affecting the wildlife. But I think they could only be a good thing for archaeological work because we get rained out of field work a lot. We have rain days the way other folks have snow days in field archaeology in Florida.
Last question.
Do you have less success in finding human remains than other places, say, in the world, because we have so much water that could destroy it? In other words, you didn't mention anything about burial sites or that kind of history and culture. So I'd be curious to know if different human cultures and how they have developed over the years here in South Florida.
And for the folks back home, we had a question about, do we have any issues identifying human remains in South Florida because of all the water here? And the answer is no. We find human remains around Florida all the time. We just have to be very careful about discussing the location because unfortunately we have a huge problem with grave robbing in this area, in this whole state. And also out of respect for people's lifeways. Because folks in the Seminole and Miccosukee tribe don't like to discuss the dead in that way. It's a different cultural taboo than we have. We've ended up finding all kinds of burials, both underwater and on land. Is anyone familiar with NAGPRA, the NAGPRA? So there's a piece of legislation passed in 1990, the Native American Grave Protection and Repatriation Act. That really applies to human remains in collections rather than in archaeological digs. But NAGPRA kind of requires us to reach out to all of the indigenous tribes in any given state. It's often on a state-by-state, case-by-case basis. And contact them about human remains that are in different collections that receive federal funding. And try to follow their lifeways, try to repatriate those human remains back to them. And that law was passed in 1990. I am actually 2 days older than NAGPRA. And originally, all of the human remains in all of the federally funded institutions were supposed to be repatriated within 6 months. And it has been 34 years, and that hasn't happened. So that's ongoing. We have a new Secretary of the Interior who's been working to revamp NAGPRA. There was a public comment period a couple years ago, and now they're having a bit more stringent regulations. And in Florida, we also have Chapter 872, which covers unmarked burials. And whenever we run into those, sometimes that can sort of whenever we run into an unmarked burial in Florida, that triggers this set of things we have to do. We have to actually first call the medical examiner. They have to determine whether this was like a recent murder or not. And if they determine that this is not a recent murder, then they talk to the archaeologists about it. And we as archaeologists then reach out to the Seminole and Miccosukee tribes. And for the most part, they want us to reinter those remains, not do carbon dating, not do genetic testing, because that destroys part of the bone in order to do those things, and just return their ancestors to the land, because it's a really important part of their spirituality to go back in there. So the short answer is we do run into human remains. We just had to be really cautious about how we treat those people. And there's been a lot of really intense legal fights about what happens when we do encounter human remains in Florida. Oh yeah, sorry.
I think that's a great place to end. A great topic to end the talk. Thank you so much. Thank you for a very interesting talk. I have for you the coveted Fish and Friends certificate that, where do you want us to stand? Okay.